Well, good evening. I'm glad to see all of you here tonight. This is a fun experience. You're in for a wonderful treat. For those of you who want a little bit of background about our speaker, in 1986, he came to New York with $9 in his pocket. Now, some of you are thinking, well, I got $9 in my pocket. What makes him so special? Well, where he came from then and where he is right now is a dramatic difference in his life. He's accomplished a number of wonderful things. One of the major things that he had happen to him is in 1991, he won a, how do you call it? He won an opportunity to go to a sales program by Zig Ziglar. Raise your hands, how many of you have heard of Zig Ziglar? Now, the cool part about this is he got to know Zig Ziglar and was one of the few people that Zig Ziglar took under his arm. And I say this in all due respect to my dear, dear friend, Zig Ziglar. Our speaker, Krish, I think is a little bit better. And I had dinner with him tonight, and I said that to him, and he said, well, he says it's a different generation. Basically, when you take a gentleman as well-known and as wonderful and as delightful as our dear friend Zig Ziglar, and you improve upon him, because this is the second generation, in my opinion, you end up with Krish. Now, he's a delightful person. I've spoken with him several times. I've heard him speak several times, and every time I am completely inspired by his message. The good news is you will not be able to keep notes tonight. That's the good news, because he just flows with wisdom and wonderful information. But the other good news is it's being videotaped, so you'll be able to watch it and stop it and write down that information. I mean, the way I know he's a really good presenter is my wife takes notes when we sit and have dinner with him tonight. My wife never takes notes when I eat dinner with her. So it's a little bit of a touchy situation, but it's okay. He's the only speaker that I know that can take you from laughter to tears and back again within seconds. He's that good. He's a very inspiring presenter. Let me share with you some of the organizations for whom he has spoken. The United States Army, Christian Dior, Steel Case Industries, Apollo Hospitals, EDS, Texas Instruments, PepsiCo, Energizer Batteries, and the most prestigious estate planning law firm in California, Preston Estate Planning. I added one, but it's true. Please welcome Krish Dhanam.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that warm welcome, which I so richly deserve, but so seldom get. How many of you have figured out through perceptive intuition that I'm not a native of Texas? Okay, we got a semi-alert group here today. Owing to the fact that I'm originally from a different country, and owing to the fact that we may have some communication problems, I just want to set the parameters right. Raise your right hand for me like this. Everybody do this. This is America's universal symbol for fantastic or absolutely nothing. Now go ahead and put it on your chin. For those of you who missed, the chin is this pointed thing at the end of the face, and I know I have my work cut out for me. What you did was react to that which you saw instead of respond to that which you believe. Reaction is based on life's possibles, and I'm talking to an august group of superachievers. When I landed in this country in 1986 with $9 in my pocket, I never in my wildest dreams imagined that one day I would have the distinct pleasure to speak to a group of people who I call the backbone of a nation that saved the world. You are, in my mind, the greatest generation of people I will ever speak to, not just because of your contribution, but because of the foundation you represent. Now, I know there are some perceptions in the group right now. Most of you are saying he's from India. He's probably a doctor. Few of you are convinced I'm an engineer, and 3 of you are pretty sure I own a motel. And all of you might be entitled to your own opinion. The talk is called "The American Dream Has No Snooze Button." And I'm going to talk to you today about something called the foundation of a legacy. How do you define a legacy? How do you expand one? And how do you know you finished well? But to do that, we need to go through the process of understanding some very basic truths. The year is 1775. The date is the 23rd of March. The location is the St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia. The audience, the House of Burgesses. The occasion, the Second Congress. And a young man stood up and said, "No man thinks more highly than I do of the very esteemed people who have already addressed the House. But different people often see different things in different lights, and therefore, I hope it will not be thought disrespectful of these gentlemen. If entertain as I do opinions of a character very opposite to theirs, I shall be allowed to speak freely and without resolve. Mr. President, this is no time for ceremony. Besides, sir, we do not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, and he will raise up our friends to fight our battles with us. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has already begun. The next gale that sweeps in from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Why stand we here idle? Our brethren are already in the field. What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have for his life so dear, or peace so sweet? That it be purchased at the price of the chains of slavery, forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what path others might take, but for me, give me liberty, or give me death." And an entire nation marched forward. When I landed here with that $9 in my pocket, I looked at the august lineage of the people who went before me. I was fortunate enough to have a genius in the name of Mr. Ziegler to put his hand upon me and say, "You know what? I'm going to give you the secret to making it." So today what I want to do is not give you advice, because obviously you are of the ilk of people who have already mastered that, but to show you something as to why I think what you do and what you've done is so significant. It is amazing as I travel the length and breadth of this country, and I've had the now privilege of flapping these gums in 47 of the 50 states. I've been to 55 countries on 6 continents. The only places I haven't been in the US are Montana and Wyoming. Right now it's pretty hot over there. And Vermont, they already know everything. But other than that, the reality of who we are comes down to the fact that you came here this evening because you were invited, and you came here with some desire to have some answers, to have some fun, to have some camaraderie. But I want to begin by asking you, or giving you, some questions that have no answers. First, I don't know where the white goes when the snow melts. I'm not that cerebral. Second, I do not know for the life of me why drive-through ATMs have their keypad in Braille. I cannot fathom why hearing clinics advertise on the radio. And I'm not a guy who's into politics. The only thing I know about politics is poly, according to the Latin derivative, is many. And ticks are just blood-sucking creatures. My definition of a bureaucracy is a corrupt group of inept people totally committed to the concept of radically increasing the size of their numbers so they can somehow miraculously take pure raw energy and convert it into solid waste. I'm not of that ilk. I want to talk about here and now, good old-fashioned foundational Americana. The reality of the world we live in and the things we have done. So let's navigate through this process as closely and as intimately as we can. So the first thing is the impact of a generation. The questions I want us to ask ourselves is, who are we? Politicians will give you one answer, anthropologists will give you one answer, philosophers will give you one answer, theologians will give you one answer. People always ask me, Krish, tell me a little bit about yourself. I'm Anila's husband and Nick's dad. That was a blessing. Everything else was a choice. We are a byproduct of that which we are blessed with. So let me reintroduce myself to you. I'm an Indian by birth, an American by choice, a husband by union, a father by blessing, and a speaker because I failed at everything else. Those that can, do. Those that can't, teach. Who are we? We have become so indifferent to some of the things that I really wish the cameras of the world would come and interview you and ask you, what did you do with the life you were given? How did you manage to have the impact you did? How did you amass what you amassed, and how did you decide to go down the process to do the things you did? But somewhere out there, they're ignoring reality because we're not asking ourselves See, if I brought an architect of any repute right here to this city and showed them a hole in the ground, with considerable certainty that architect will tell me how tall the building is that'll fit in that hole. On what is he staking his reputation? On what is he gauging his expertise? The foundation. Because he knows if he looks at a hole in the ground, he can tell you how tall the building is. If I look at a room here, I can tell you that the foundation is what made you. Is the foundation that allowed me to meet a man like Zig Ziglar who gave me the liberated thoughts I needed. See, when I came here, the first night I watched television, I looked at my bride and I said, sweetheart, we're going to be okay. These people think they have problems. Someone asked me, what motivates you? Hot water motivates me. If you haven't had it, it would. Now, we had running water. If you needed it, you ran and got it. And that's not reasonably far from the truth, and some of you can identify with that. That may have been the humble beginnings of your parents and where you were raised. I jokingly tell people, we were so poor, we go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, lick other people's fingers. My mother was a child bride, married to Pop, little past her 14th birthday. When we celebrated my parents' 50th anniversary, my mama was all of 64. She went to live with dad at 15, brother at 16, me at 19, had to drop out in the 8th grade. Who are we? If we don't ask ourselves those foundational questions, we don't understand the impact that people make. See, at the age of 71, my mother finished her master's degree. At the age of 79, my father just began his PhD. My father studied under a streetlight to graduate from college. Poverty, hardship, tradition, they are all part of an existence, but we can't sweep it under the rug because it is a reality of who we are. Second, where do we come from? America is a fickle society in many different ways, but the most fascinating about the current generation is this. They borrow money they don't have, to buy things they don't need, to impress people they don't like, to become someone they can't recognize. Because they don't have the understanding of the foundations, the simple arithmetic that you need to have to do something significant. Where do we come from? I'll always be Mr. and Mrs. Dunham's baby boy. In fact, next month, I go back to India, and I go there 5 times a year. I put on events like this for people in India who can't come to hotels like this. But one of the seminars I'm going to host next month in India is a seminar based on my latest book dedicated to my dad. Dad doesn't know we're going to honor him. See, I remember a couple of years ago when I went to India, and I thought I was hot stuff because I'd accomplished something as a speaker, I'd written books, I'd shared the stage with presidents. The way they introduced me was, they said, we can read a lot about his bio, but what's the most important thing today is he's Mr. and Mrs. Dunham's baby boy. So my whole identity was wrapped in the fact that I was the progeny of 2 people celebrated in that little hamlet. And that's why I say, tell people, until we know who we are and where we come from, it's very hard. See, part of the narrative that I've seen in the last 5 years in the economy at large, society in general, has been the fact that our foundations have no gratitude. Hans Selye, the great stress specialist, said gratitude is the healthiest of all human emotions, anger the most destructive. In fact, I have a little thing I like to do which kind of calms people down. It's been said that every third person in this world is either amazingly beautiful and unusually bright, incredibly handsome and unfailingly brilliant. Take a good look at the person on your left. Go ahead. Now take a good look at the person on your right. Like me, you're probably convinced it ain't either one of them. From this moment forward, think of yourself as that third person. You were designed for accomplishment, engineered for success, and endowed with the seeds of greatness. Who are we? Where do we come from? The third question is very important. Whom do we credit with what we have become? It's called the law of the inner circle. I can tell you without any fear of error, if it wasn't for that bride that God gave me all those years ago that I'll be married to 28 years next year, who prayed for me every night and cheerled me every day, I would not be your speaker today. The law of the inner circle is important, and you're successful because you had it. You have it. You continue to celebrate it. But the popular narrative outside doesn't talk about it that way. Every sitcom portrays father as a bumbling idiot and mom as superwoman, maybe rightfully so. I tell people I've been married 27 years. It's been the best 17 years of her life. For the first 10, I had all the answers. They were wrong. Marriage is grand. Divorce is 100 grand. Someone asked me one time, how often should I tell my wife I love her? I said, before somebody else does. But as Adrian Rogers would say, if that woman ever leaves me, I'm going with her. Whom do we credit with what we have become? I was speaking in one of the cities in this country, and there was a reporter, negative by the way. Apparently that seems to be the hallmark to be a reporter. The media has accurately predicted 28 of the last 2 recessions. Let's just get that out of the way. But this reporter decided to take a pot shot at me. He said one of the speakers was a husky Indian in a finely tailored suit. He looked like some pseudo-disciple of Zig Ziglar, had patriotic fervor to him, but for whatever reason left to a favorable ovation. This guy is so negative, he'd demand a bacteria count on the milk of human kindness. Have you ever noticed some people will brighten up the whole room by leaving? They usually say a narrow mind and a fat head usually come on the same body, and some people are so narrow-minded they look through a keyhole with both eyes. You know the type. Walk around looking like someone's licked all the red off their candy. So he wrote a scathing review. Now the freedom of speech, the right that gives him the desire to write such a review, is the same one that gives me the right to a rebuttal. And I don't know why these guys who criticize everything put their email address as if they want to advertise. Here I am, take a shot at me, but nobody does. Well, Mama didn't raise no fool. So I wrote to him, I said, dear sir, I read your article with considerable enthusiasm because as a writer I marveled at your sheer ability to make prose dance off a page. But I took exception to 3 of your points. You said I was a pseudo-patriot, and I challenge you to any speech from Patrick Henry down to Martin Luther King. You take a day to prepare, I'll take a day to prepare, same crowd. When you speak, they'll stand and clap. When I speak, they'll stand and march. Don't doubt my patriotism. Second, you said I was a disciple of Mr. Ziglar, and I checked out my 1828 Noah Webster dictionary, which Mr. Ziglar gave me. Incidentally, you know why Webster wrote the dictionary? Every day his wife kept saying, what does that mean? Poor guy, at the end of it, he ended up with a dictionary. Here's the serious side. In the 1828 Noah Webster dictionary, this is a fact, you can check it out. The word optimism is listed, the word pessimism isn't. It's a modern day invention. I said, I looked at the word disciple, and it's a constant student like disciple of Plato. Mr. Z would be proud. Third, I sent your article to my parents in India who don't know what a critic is. They were just excited that their little boy's name was mentioned in the same article as General Colin Powell, Rudy Giuliani, Joe Montana, and the like. And I said, by the way, sir, I've traveled much of the free world, and I've never seen a statue erected to a critic. So I'm under the humble opinion that you're not held in such high esteem after all. One word reply, touché. See, anybody can criticize. And that's part of the genius of what we experience. Like I said, I've traveled much of the world. I was in Istanbul, Turkey, doing a seminar, and someone was trashing this country. And I thought to myself, man, I need to say something. I'm, after all, an American citizen. But you're in Istanbul, Turkey, where if you disagree with them, the first thing they do is put a cloth over your head and put you on home video. It doesn't end up well. But I decided I'd take a stand. I said, friend, don't trash my lovely country. Most people who don't like her already live there. I said, but we're going to take a field trip. Till you can show me an embassy in the world that does not have a line in front of it, I ain't buying what you're selling. Whom do we credit with what we have become? Question 4, what makes us laugh? For me, ignorance makes me laugh, and God, I see it in such abundant supply, especially when I travel. You walk into an airport, and people are yelling at the only person in the airport who can't fly a plane. Nobody yells at the pilot. He says, get off my bird. And common sense is not common practice. Think about it. Sometimes we refuse to wear our seatbelt on the ground because we think we're in control. Oh, just go into the store. But in the plane, everybody buckles up. 6-seaters, 747. Click, 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 click. Folks, I don't care how well you buckled up there. If something happens to that sucker, we're gonna die. We're not logical. We're the most emotional of all species pretending to be logical, and that makes me laugh. By the way, there's some new scientific evidence. If you have a tendency to laugh and you suppress the laughter, it'll come back inside and spread your hips. Let it out. Now, that doesn't mean you walk around grinning from ear to ear like you've eaten a banana sideways, but at least put a little pep in your step, a little bounce to your ounce. I was standing in the airport behind a celebrity. She had already arrived. She had a primetime sitcom. But she was being, and I don't like to be rude, so I'm an English guy, so let me try to find the best way. She was being an equine posterior. It'll come to some of you, you'll just, if not nudge your neighbor, what did he mean? And I was watching this diatribe between this lady who had already accomplished so much, yelling at the flight attendant. She didn't want to produce her ID. Post 9/11 world, we're all supposed to produce our ID. Except if you want to vote. But that's a whole different issue. I wasn't born in Louisiana, but I hope they'll bury me there. That way I can continue to vote. No, so this lady was being quite obnoxious, so I tapped her on the shoulder. I said, ma'am, all of us celebrities have to use and show our ID. She looked at me and said, who are you? I said, Gandhi. Eleanor Roosevelt said other people can tell us what we can or cannot do, only we can fulfill it. She also added, if somebody has to tell you who you are, you ain't. What makes me laugh is as I travel the length and breadth of this world, I find people not enjoying this one subtlety of life, laughter. What makes me laugh is the inability of people to laugh. Now, hear me carefully when I make the next statement. It's quite serious. The reason we have lost our ability to laugh is we have been bookended by political correctness. And political correctness, my friends, will be the death of this nation. I got tired of it. And I said, I'm not going to be politically correct anymore. It just robs humanity from the simple expression of emotional joy because people are walking on eggshells. One guy walked up to me the other day, he says, oh, my doctor is from India, do you know him? No, he doesn't know me either. Someone else wanted to get a great, cultural explanation. What's the reason for the dot on the head? I don't know. What do I look like? The center of encyclopedia of everything that's Indian? There are 1 billion people over there. I love this one. Do you like spicy food? Well, eat a jalapeno. I don't know. I came here because I was looking for an opportunity and I do not want to be curtailed. Oh, here's the best one. I was speaking in Phoenix at one of these American Indian hyphenated reservation casino, airplane hangar, optometrist, where, they have everything. Mass confusion masquerading as reality. So I'm blowing and going on my speech, and this lady, I said something, as far as Indians go, I'm the real deal. And she just stood up in the middle of the presentation and looked at me and she says, I can't believe you said that. I'm offended. I said, why? She says, I'm a full-blooded Native American Indian. I said, ma'am, Columbus was looking for me. He found you by mistake. Sit down. And the reason we get our political correctness all confused is we think Columbus was a navigator. By no stretch of the imagination can you call that dude a navigator. He was supposed to hang a left and find me. He hung a right and found you. But he did what most salespeople do. He went back to brag on the account, didn't stay back to service it. Along came Amerigo Vespucci. We named the country after him, and all Columbus got was a city in Ohio. What makes us grieve is the loss of wonder and the loss of innocence. When you look at the wonder of this country, nobody's selling it anymore. Everybody's angry. Why aren't we talking about Ilona Zimmerman, who escaped her communist Hungary and went across the barbed wire invested fields and landed in metropolitan Detroit and became one of the best real estate salespeople in that city of Detroit? With her guttural accent, she didn't sell real estate, she didn't sell property, she sold a piece of the greatest land on planet Earth. Why are we not talking about Sam Moore, who escaped Lebanon and came here almost broke and went on to become the chairman of the board of directors of Thomas Nelson Publishing? Why are we not celebrating those stories of the heartbeat and the pulse that made this experiment grand? See, what makes me grieve is the loss of that wonder. It's always someone else's fault. By the way, if some of you disagree with what I'm saying, just gently hit the person next to you on the head. I'll know you're upset. I won't slow down, but we'll deal with it later. What makes me grieve is the loss of wonder. My son, who's now in college, could text with his nose, type with his toes, listen to music, multitask, and when he sees the atrocity of a Virginia Tech on his television, he doesn't even flinch because that abhorrence is the new normal. Can you imagine we have arrived in a culture where the abnormal is normal, wrong is right, bad is good, because we have foundationally gone away from values. Dennis Waitley said, value is in the doer, not the deed. Eric Hoffer said, in times of change, it is the learners who will inherit the earth, while the learned will find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. The august, the elite. My mentor, Mr. Ziegler, used to say, Krish, I speak at the 7th grade, 3rd month level. That way even college professors can understand. Common sense is not common practice anymore. But we were raised on that. I was. At dinner today, I was telling them. The reason for my course correction was very simple. Every so often, my father's board of education would meet my seat of learning. I remember November 8th, 1969, the only time my father disciplined me. Obviously remember the date. November 8th, 1969, Seoul, South Korea. I'd been disrespectful to my mother, and my father reenacted a tennis match. I was the ball. When it was over and I was whimpering, totally beaten and humiliated for the thrashing I took, my dad looked at me point blank and said, son, you'll make many mistakes. Some will be yours. Society will forgive some, and they will not forgive others, but this is my woman. You'll never do that again. We have not taught our youngsters the difference between a girl and a lady. What makes me grieve? The loss of wonder, the loss of discipline, the loss of the simple things that seemed so commonplace just 20 years ago. And here we are looking at the talking heads opining about being different. But what gives us hope is tomorrow. Folks, this is still the land of the free, the home of the brave. It beats second best by a mile. It beats second best by a mile. Once we have the foundation of a legacy, let's look at the definition of a legacy. Believing is not partial in what we do, in how we act. You are all part of a cohesion. You know what it takes to preserve, to protect. You know what it takes to understand. You know what it takes to belong. But total engagement, believing is not partial. Pablo Casals was a world-famous cello player. Long after he'd achieved fame and fortune in his 90s, he migrated from Spain to the US. Long after he'd achieved fame and fortune, someone walked up to him and said, "Mr. Casals, why are you practicing?" He said, "I think I'm making progress." Now, none of us know what tomorrow brings. But all of us in this room will probably agree on something. Reality and the definition, the belonging part, only sets in when three things are accomplished. When there is a gratitude from yesterday, tradition. For those of you who remember the play that featured the Ukrainian milkman Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. When four of his daughters made four different decisions and they asked Tevye, "Why are you bothered?" Tradition, tradition, tradition. So some part of us is steeped in tradition. We like that. Some part of it is the here and now, the existential. And some part of it is the utopia, the tomorrow. But we are grounded in the fact that we had to take some of our yesterday and plan for tomorrow, so that's why we enjoy today. But the popular dream is dying because yesterday is thrown out of the window. Folks, let me ask you a question. Is it any wonder that this nation, at its inception, had the likes of Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and Adams and Washington? What were they raised on? In 1677, the New England Primer was the first book introduced into the colonies. And these people were asked to memorize 6-syllable words in the first grade. One of the most moving stories I can tell about that time is told by David Hackett Fisher, the historian, in a book where he talks about Mellon Chamberlain, a research associate from one of the Massachusetts universities who was interviewing Captain Levi Preston around the 1830 time frame. Captain Levi Preston was the oldest surviving member of the Revolutionary War, actually having fought on the day when the infamous shot was heard at Lexington and Concord. And Mellon Chamberlain asked Levi Preston, "You went up as a ragtag bunch of militiamen against the greatest imperial army known to man. What possessed you? Did you read the writings of Sidney and Locke and Harrington?" He says, "No, we read the Poor Farmer's Almanac, we read Isaac Watts' hymns, and we read the Catechism." He said, "Was it the Stamp Act?" He said, "Never saw one." "Was it the tea and the taxation on the tea?" He says, "No, our boys had already dumped it in the harbor by the time we got there." "What possessed you then to take on this fight?" I love his answer when he said, "We'd been free always and intended to always be free, and the redcoats wished it not so." That made these people fight. If you remember when Pitcairn came up to the back of that church and said, "Disband ye rebels," and the captain at that time said, "Do not fire until fired upon. But if a fight is what they want, let it begin here." Believing is not partial. Belonging is not optional. And I'm a historian, and most of you would wonder why some dude from India would want to know American history when I already had to memorize European history and Indian history when I was growing up in India. See, when I was 8, I told my dad I wanted to live in this country. And my dad made me start reading American history. He says, "One day you'll land there." Not if, one day you'll land there. And that day I don't want you to be a second-class citizen to anybody. I want you to know more about her than she knows about herself. And so I carried Indian history, European history, and American history as a child. In 1991, when I was going through my citizenship process at the Earl Cabell Federal Building in Dallas, Texas, I was going through the process, and back then it was slightly different. You actually had to know history to pass the test. Which is fascinating. Most of my American friends couldn't pass it either. But that's a whole different issue. The lady asked me what happened in 1862, and I was ready to put a verbal dump on her because I had pretty much understood the entire Emancipation Proclamation process. She beckoned her hand ever so gently and said, "Oh no, honey, in America it's multiple choice." And I knew I was going to make it. But when this country was founded, first president we had was Washington. On their heels came Adams and Jefferson. Bitter rivals. One was the other's vice president. They fought quite vehemently. Jefferson wanted what we now know as the Jeffersonian democracy. Adams wanted the more monarchical style. He was more European in his leanings. His son at that time, John Quincy, was already serving as ambassador to France, I think. And Jefferson and Adams became bitter rivals. One Dr. Benjamin Rush, a Methodist minister, told them that they needed to reconcile because he had already seen a divine reconciliation for them. And after they finished their presidency, after they stopped talking, for 13 years before they died, they wrote letters to each other, praising each other's virtue and deliverance to this nation at the fledgling state. John Adams, one of his famous quotes, his posterity, "You will never know what it cost my generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it. If you do not, I'll repent in eternity for having spent half the time to preserve it." When they started writing to each other, those letters are in the Library of Congress. But Benjamin Rush's words came true. Many of you may know the story, many of you may not. Because on July 4th of 1826, on that Sunday, both these men died on the same day, 50 years to the date of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The last words of John Adams, "Thank God this nation still has Thomas Jefferson," not realizing that Jefferson passed away that morning. But let's fast forward. August 2nd, 1826, one Daniel Webster is called to memorialize these two. But the concurrence of their deaths on the anniversary of independence has naturally awakened stronger emotions. Both had been president. Both were patriots. Both had that early agency to the act of independence. It cannot but seem extraordinary that these two should live to see the 50th year of the anniversary of that date, and then complete the year. And that then on the day that forever fast-linked their own fame with their country's glory, the heavens should open to receive them both at once. As their lives themselves were acts of providence, who will not recognize in their happy termination as well as their long continuance proofs that our country and its benefactors were objects of his care? Belonging is not optional. See, I just got done telling you about the morality-based initiatives that this nation had in its infancy, which resulted in the likes of those people shaping a republic to be the most preferred destination on planet Earth, because America is the only country on planet Earth that has at least one person from every other principality recognized by the United Nations who live here as an immigrant. It's the only place where you can come from anywhere and call yourself an American. You can't go to France and call yourself French. Not that you'd want to. When you look at the thread and we read what shapes generational influence, when I was asked to come here, I considered it my biggest honor. And folks, I do this 120 times a year, and I've done it for 20 years. Because I wanted that privilege to finally stand in front of a group and thank them for a nation such as this. I can't wait for the DVD, for the simple reason that it's not it's my own tribute to the fact that I got to do it at some point. When I deal with the youngsters in schools, my heart grieves for their lack of understanding of what went before them that allowed. This is not an experiment. When 9/11 happened, my life became a living hell. I'm the one who's randomly pre-selected for screening. But I've trained the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Federal Marshals, the Department of Defense, the Immigration Service before it became Homeland Security. And you ask all of them, what's a terrorist look like? They say someone who's 6'1" and has facial hair. I understand why I'm randomly picked all the time. But when 9/11 happened, I had a choice to make. Do I cower and start blaming the country that gave me refuge? It's easy to do that. See, Mr. Ziegler, you say you put one finger that way, you got 3 times as many pointing back at you. Blame is easy. You wake up in the morning, you can only look through the lens with 2 frames, aim frame, blame frame. Aim frame says, let me turn my hurts into halos, my scars into stars. Blame frame says it's someone else's fault. Victimization, pity party. The problem with pity parties, nobody comes. Those that do don't bring presents. I was on a flight to Tampa, Florida 4 days after 9/11, sitting in the front of the plane. Even now I get to sit in the front of the plane. The only thing they don't let me do is fly the plane, but that's again because of the way I look. I got up to use the restroom. A lady started screaming. You feel this small. I've just given you 2 renditions of famous American speeches from rote. And you feel cut down to size. And you have a choice to make. Do you cower and retreat? Or do you stand tall and claim? So I stood tall because belonging is not optional. I stood in front of my church and I told them that day my profile in terror was very simple. I said, if this land asked me to pick up arms and fight in the very land that sent me here, I would have to, because one day when I needed refuge, she gave it to me. We can dance that way 9 different ways from Sunday, because one of the days after 9/11, my boy comes home and he's crying. Someone in school had done mean things. They said, damn all you foreigners, send them all home. No fault of his own. He was born in Denton County, Texas. In fact, I remember some way we were having a party the other day and someone said, my God, he doesn't have an accent. I said, yeah, they're geographic, they're not genetic. What do you expect, a little guy with a loincloth and a turban? He was born in Texas. When my boy is crying saying, Papa, they're calling me mean names, your heart breaks. I looked at my boy and I said, son, I can't change 1 iota of how you look. I can't change 1 iota of how your mom and I sound. But this I can change. From this day forward, I will sing the praises of this country and the gratitude we have to live here. You know why? Not some old-fashioned pie-in-the-sky dream, but the reason is real simple. Son, one day when you're walking the paved streets of opportunity, I want someone to walk up to you and say, Nick, I'm sure glad your dad came to America. He changed my way of thinking. Son, I can give you a good name. Ultimately, that's what a legacy is. You give a good name. See, when you go through this optional belonging, which is what we're seeing out there, that's where the problems begin. People are always so uncomfortable. Well, you know, we all have to get along. Folks, if 2 people agree on everything, one of them is unnecessary. We're not all supposed to get along. But because we don't teach morality in our schools is the reason we are where we are in society. Anthropology doesn't depart very far from the cultural norms that we are experiencing. Think about it. The Thomas Jefferson Research Institute said by 1953, the percentage of morality in our schools was so small, it was not even worth measuring. Where have we gone? Because they haven't listened to you. They haven't listened to you. You did it. You did it well. You did it right. You have something to show for it. You protected it. You preserved it. You allowed yourself to go through the process by listening to wise counsel, and you arrived at a point, but nobody is listening. But as much as I'd like to be that person, this is what I go around telling people. I disagree with Tom Brokaw on just about every part of his political ideology. But that book, The Greatest Generation, is the best book I've ever read. We can't. It's not an option. This is not a vacuum. How did Benjamin Franklin put it? He says, democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb debating on what to have for lunch. Liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting that vote. To which I, your humble immigrant correspondent, would like to add, tyranny is a bunch of rats blaming the wolves and the lambs. I tell people, if you don't want to be a wolf, be a lamb, but for crying out loud, quit listening to the rats. They got nothing on anybody. Lily Tomlin, the comedian, put it best when she said, Even if you win the rat race, you're still a rat. See, sometimes we get caught up on the wrong side of the equation. Participating, non-negotiable. 50% of a nation. Here's what Adrian Rogers said in 1984. How many many of you have read the book 1984 by George Orwell? 3 things he wrote in this book. He wrote the book in 1948, by the way. In 1948, he writes about 1984, which has come and gone. He said, freedom will be slavery. 3 major points. Ignorance will be strength, and war will be peace. And we've experienced that. But in 1984, Adrian Rogers put it this way. You cannot legislate the poor into freedom by legislating the wealthy out of freedom. And what one man gets without working for, another man must work for without getting. And the government cannot give to anybody anything that the government does not first take from somebody. And if one half of the people get the idea that it does no good to work because somebody is going to get what I work for, and the other half of the people begin to realize that they don't need to work because somebody is going to take care of them, that, dear friends, is the end of any nation. And we have experienced every part of it. Daniel Webster put it differently when he said, if we and our posterity reject religious instruction and authority, violate the principles of eternal ethics, trifle on moral injunction, and recklessly destroy the political constitution that upholds us, no man can say how sudden the catastrophe that will overwhelm us and bury all our glory in profound obscurity. We've experienced both ends. But people don't want to tell you all of the story. See, when the likes of Bertrand Russell and Friedrich Nietzsche came on the horizon and created this utopia, this philosophical utopia, America began to lose its bearings on its foundations. Bertrand Russell wrote a book called The Problems with Philosophy. He spends 2 entire chapters talking about how when light bounces off and refracts off particles that are in a desk, you and I will see it differently because of the way we see properties as they interfere with light. Have you ever noticed people with nothing to say have got the biggest books? Someone asked me one time, when you read Bertrand Russell, did you begin to appreciate philosophy? I said, no, I started hating furniture. See, common sense is not common practice. Seductive, open-ended thoughts say participating is negotiable. Give it your all. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But that's not how my daddy went to work. When he started his PhD at 79, my pop still takes the flask he took when he was a foreman. He takes a cup of coffee in that flask and a sandwich that Mama makes him. He drives his little car and he goes to the university. And I said, Dad, what's your greatest accomplishment doing your PhD at 79 by going full-time to the university as a research associate? He says, I've begun to realize at my age, the biggest expense is parking. He says, they're just so baffled by the fact that I'm doing it my age, they don't even know what to charge me. Reporter got wind of this, asked my pop. He says, why are you doing it? He says, because I can. Simple, nothing complex. Participating, non-negotiable. They said, Mr. Dhanam, you'll be 83 by the time you finish. He said, how old will I be if I didn't? See, that's a different kind of thought process, and you're enjoying it because you know what I'm talking about. And you're wishing like me that it was broad, and every morning when we switched on the TV, this is what our kids would hear. Common sense. One foot in front of the other. This guy goes to the doctor, he says, doctor, when I touch my nose, it hurts. When I touch my knee, it hurts. When I touch my chest, it hurts. Doctor says, yes, your finger's broken. Quit touching everything. This other guy goes to the doctor, slightly advanced in age, and the doctor tells him something, and that afternoon, the doctor sees him on the street. The guy is frolicking, he's got a pretty young girl on his arm, and he's having the time of his life. The doctor looks at him and says, what are you doing? He says, Doc, I'm listening to your advice. He says, what advice? He says, you told me to get a hot mama and be cheerful. He says, well, we need to add listening to one of your problems because I told you you have a heart murmur. Be careful. See, when we give options at the definition stage, things begin to. So one of the things that I have enjoyed in my journey is articulating to myself a few things. False pride is vanity. And a lot of people out there who claim to know the answers have false pride. Conceit is a weird disease. It affects everybody except the person who has it. But a genuine pride says, been there, done it, got a t-shirt, whatever the nomenclature is different. I remember one time I was on a private jet with Mr. Ziegler. And this was now the time of my life where just me and him were zipping around the country. And I was excited. Immigrant boy had arrived. The inside six-seater plane flying all over the place. See, I'm of the old school. I tell people money is not everything, but it ranks reasonably close to oxygen. But see, money bought me a house. In fact, it bought me two. It'll never buy me a home with laughter. Money bought me a bed. It'll never buy me a good night's sleep. It bought me a companion. It won't buy me a friend for life. It bought me a good time, but it won't buy me peace of mind. I like the things money will buy. But I love the things money can't buy. So there I am sitting in this private jet getting caught up. And I looked at Mr. Ziegler and I said, why did we not request this earlier? I love his answer, filled with wisdom. He said, son, there is no we. He says, this is a result of my reputation. Your job is to tell the pilot I'm ready. See, they don't make him like that anymore, who can look you in the eye and tell you, hear me carefully. The reason you've been successful at what you've done is you understood the difference between constructive critics and destructive critics. And you welcomed the constructive critics into your life. And you kept the destructive critics at bay. Constructive critics are people who look at you and say, hey, if you did this, 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 and did not do this, you'd be okay. They want to see you grow, so they try to take away the faults that are holding you back. Destructive critics are people who just want to tear you down. Most people with a problem don't want a solution. They want to tell you about it, you about it, you about it. If you follow up and solve the problem, they can't tell you again, you again, you again. But we've created a culture out there that seems to like the attention that comes with having a problem. See, when you have two people with two problems and no solution, all you get is a new verse for kumbaya. Nothing happens. And I'm so tired as I travel to see what's being put out there. I tell people, and again, I advise a lot of the people on speech making and all, and they always ask me this question. What is the moment of truth? And I always give them these three. Unless your message consistently tells people believing is not partial. Think about it. The reason we arrive at partial definitions and escape clauses is because we want to impress everybody. The word that's used is relativism. Everything is not relative. Some things are right, some things are wrong. Some things are good, some things are bad. Some things are yes, some things are no. You'll never ask a young lady, and she'll never tell you, I think I'm relatively pregnant. 9 months from now, she's in for a relative surprise. Let's look at the next component. By the way, that's a picture of Mr. Ziegler sitting in front of mail that came by the pound. When he passed away last year, I had the privilege of having lunch with him back in May. The Alzheimer's had already set in. This is my hero, the man I loved more, probably in some instances, than my own father, because Mr. Ziegler raised me. Someone pointed that out earlier. I've never called him anything but Mr. Ziegler. The reverence. But I remember when we took this picture, I said, Mr. Z, why do you prepare so hard? You're now making $75,000 a speech, which means when you go, it's $500. And he said, son, today in the audience will be the grandson of the grandfather I impacted 50 years ago. That grandfather will send the grandson saying, you're having a negative day, go and old Zig will fix it up. He said, I don't want the grandson to go back to the grandfather and say, Granddaddy, when you had him, he was young and energetic. When I got him, he was just going through the motions. I owe it to the trust the grandfather has. And I said, wow, to have that kind of zest for life, to be preparing at that stage. I remember one time when the plane landed, and this was before 9/11 when you can actually make jokes, but we were on the plane and the captain says, ladies and gentlemen, we're making our final approach. So he called the flight attendant and said, ma'am, you need to tell him to make it his next to final approach. I still have things to do. Someone asked him one time, Mr. Z, I'd heard you'd retired. He says, no, I'm refired. He says, I ain't going to ease up, let up, put up, or shut up until I'm taken up. In fact, I'm just getting warmed up. Zest for life. Because he actually lived these principles. And finally, how do you expand this legacy? You planned, you prepared, you expected. You made a mark, you left an impression. Here's the thing. Fred Smith Sr., not the FedEx Fred Smith, the other gentleman who was head of a couple of organizations and lived in Dallas, he wrote a book called You and Your Network. And he has a website called breakfastwithfred.com. Fred passed away, he was in his 90s, but his daughter maintains his website. It's probably the single greatest collection of wisdom that any one person left on planet Earth, breakfastwithfred.com. It'll inspire you beyond your wildest imagination. When he was in his 90s and on dialysis, they would take him in a hospital bed twice a year to Palm Springs from Dallas. And CEOs of major companies would gather around him and hear him opine for 2 days. And the last question they always asked him is, when can we do this again? He was a genius beyond. He said, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking less often of yourself. But he also added, saying, every great teacher should be looking for a great student, because every great student is looking for a great teacher. There's not one of us in this room smarter than all of us put together. There is so much knowledge here that translates into wisdom. Wisdom is nothing more than the correct use of knowledge. So as much as I'd like to celebrate what you've already done, what I want you to consider doing is make sure that you impart that which you have accumulated and amassed, that allowed you to become who you are. Give it away. Make sure that people, again, you know, when I think of all the things I've had the privilege of doing, I've shared the stage with 2 presidents, titans of industry, captains of enterprise. But I've always reacted by dealing with them in the way I thought I would learn something. I never got caught up in the celebrity. I remember one time I was speaking to Bill Cosby. We were in a green room. He doesn't know me from Adam, but he was there, I was there. He kind of realized that I did what he did for that moment. We were both mic'd. And I said, Mr. Cosby, can I have some wisdom from you? See, most people would walk up to him and say, do you know who you are? And with his jello voice, he'd say, well, you know, that's how it would go. But I looked at him and I said, I need some wisdom from you. And here's what he said. He gave me wisdom from his grandfather. His grandfather said, there's no amount of wealth that will escape greed. The very poor want more of it. The very rich want to keep all of it. Somewhere between the two is reality. Now, if I hadn't asked him the question, I would have never gotten that wisdom. But in the roles you occupy, people are not going to ask you that information. But make sure you document it. If you have an uncle or an aunt or someone who gave you the wisdom of the ages that you were able to parlay into something significant, make sure that the children, the grandchildren, they get to learn it. They get to get it in the form of lessons and as an active way. One of my greatest regrets is that I left home when I was very young. One of my greatest successes is that I got a man who never let go of me. See, I left home when I was 24. I was holding my dad's arms between that barbed wire fence, and my dad's only wisdom to me was, son, for every step you take forward, I'll take one right behind you. God forbid you ever fall. I'll be right there to catch you. Don't be afraid to succeed. But that was not enough, because what happens is there's a lot of stuff that goes on in this world. So you planned, you prepared, you expected. Let me give you a couple of illustrations. Communication is where all of this thing actually works. And there's no finesse to it. See, most of us are stuck in what we call frivolous communication. Frivolous communication is meaningless banter. It's just talking to one another and going through the motion. And that's okay to a point. When I talk to my son, sometimes it's frivolous communication. Where are you going? Nowhere. What you doing? Nothing. Who you going with? No one. When you coming back? Don't know. Can I borrow $20? Let me get this straight. You want to go nowhere with no one to do nothing and not know when you're coming back, yet I get to finance it. I ain't the government. That's not how this works. But that's frivolous conversation. Frivolous conversation is the kind of conversation that takes place in an elevator in Dallas, Texas. Took place in an elevator in this hotel. Can you believe the heat? Yep. What do you expect from me? I'm not the weatherman. But what they're saying is, I don't know any more about you or your background, so I'm just going to stay in frivolous. Level 2 is more fun, factual. Factual communication, you have to be careful as to how you assess the facts because you could upset people. Communication is fun on so many levels. For example, you tell a lady that she looks like the first day of spring, and you'll win all kinds of points. Same message, but if you tell her she looks like the last day of a long, drawn-out winter, it'll backfire. If you look at her and say, when I look into your eyes, the hands of time come to a standstill, you'll be a romantic. But if you tell her she got a face that'll stop a clock, that you get into all kinds of trouble. So factual communication, you have to be careful. One day I came home and I asked my bride, I said, sweetheart, what's wrong? She said, apparently I'm the only one in this house who knows how to load a dishwasher. Being the A-type personality, I said, apparently you are. When I pulled the fork out of my ear and stopped the bleeding, I said, that was rather harsh. See, she was not looking for an answer. She's taking care of that house, no thanks to me. Whereas I went in my mind, I was all analytical. And ladies, in my own defense, I don't know what the deal is about loading a dishwasher right. Why does it have to be plate, 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 bowl, 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 fork, 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 knife, knife? What are you worried about? That during the Sud cycle, the plate and the bowl are going to get to know each other and refuse to go back to their respective places? It's a dishwasher. But frivolous conversation, factual conversation, most of society is wrapped on that. Level 3 is where the fun begins, feeling. In feeling communication, people begin to take notice of your impact. People begin to understand that you were more than the sum total of your resume. People begin to take notice of the fact that you have something to offer that is significant, that can alter their lives in remarkable ways. June 7, 1994. I took a donation of $500 from my then employer in Dallas and walked into an ashram in Calcutta. The ashram of Nobel laureate, future saint, Mother Teresa. She opened her door, bent at the waist for the last 60 years, serving the dying and the destitute, the very dregs of humanity, in the leper colonies of India. She opened the door and looked into my eyes and held my hands and said, come on in. I thought there'd be a line. I thought there'd be a visitation desk. I thought there'd be a secretary, get an appointment. No, come on in. I walk in and I'm sitting next to greatness for the next 18 minutes. But the ego is so fragile. More than anything else, I wanted to make my mark. I said, if I stand next to a future saint and get a picture, then I can come back and put it on my wall in Dallas and all my buddies and buddies could go, you the man. As Frank Sinatra would say, I've seen the Pope, all you need to do now is kiss my ring. Holiness by proxy. I asked Mother Teresa for a picture. She said, I don't do this for publicity. I do. She said, okay, reluctantly. I put my arm around her so it'll look close. And someone took 3 brilliant pictures with the lens cover on. I came back and I was disillusioned. But as I was leaving her ashram, she called me back and I thought, picture. Instead, she handed me 10 envelopes. What are these, pray tell? These are letters of encouragement to my sisters who man the AIDS hospices in Washington and New York, Chicago, San Francisco. Let me get this straight. I just gave you $500. I don't have a picture. Now you're giving me letters to mail in the US and I'm assuming I got to come up with the postage. At least that's what the mind is thinking. But the feeling communication with which she concluded that comment was brilliant. She said, I want to be a good steward of the resources you gave me. You're going there anyway. It's cheaper if you mail them there. I didn't want to argue with her. I didn't want to get hit by a lightning bolt. I carried the letters, realizing that this was one plane that would never go down. I was carrying holy cargo. I came back to Dallas and I mailed her letters, and I wrote Mother Teresa a letter. Dear Mother Teresa, thank you for the privilege of allowing me to be a small messenger in your great commission. And she sent me a picture. But the front of that letter was what changed my life. It sits on my nightstand. Dear Krish Dhanam, say yes to the least of humanity. By picking up those most deserving in the eyes of a loving God, you will have participated in the greatest good of all, love, Mother Teresa. And that was the day my desire was born to do something for the land of my birth. It didn't happen that day, it didn't happen the next day, but a couple of years later we were able to start a foundation, and I go because of that letter that Mother Teresa sent me. Feeling. See, in frivolous communication, nobody cares you're there. In factual communication, they just react because you're there. In feeling communication, they respond because you're there. Level 4 and 5 are hard. Fellowship communication is when people continue to perform because you were once in their lives. And freedom communication is you don't care what you say because you know you speak the truth. And I've gotten to one point where I don't do what I do for a popularity contest. But I remember one time Billy Graham was in that last level. Billy Graham had come to England. And Billy Graham's taken a lot of pot shots in his life from people who thought they know better. But the track record proves otherwise. You have to have done something of significance in this world to be one of the only people on the planet to have consistently made it to the top 10 most admired people on earth for 50 consecutive years. As we'd say down home, that's some tall cotton. Billy Graham was in England and a negative reporter. Apparently they're everywhere. The negative reporter walks up to Dr. Graham and says, you're a hypocrite. Incidentally, a hypocrite is someone who complains about the sex, violence, and nudity on their DVD. So, Billy, I don't know where that joke was born, but it died right here. So, Billy Graham was asked, he says, you're a hypocrite. He says, why? He says, you're going to talk about humility and all the other virtues of a great life, and yet you have the audacity to come in on a luxury liner. And Billy Graham said, I don't get your point. He said, well, you're going to get up and talk in some kind of a religious context about someone who came in on a donkey, aren't you? Isn't that the text of your speech? So Billy Graham said, yeah, I still don't get your point. He says, how can you say that the world was saved by someone who rode on a donkey, but you came in on a luxury liner? This is the genius of why the man made it to the 50 years, top 10. He said, son, you find me a donkey that'll cross the Atlantic, and I'll take it. Mr. Ziegler was on a radio program in Phoenix, Arizona, and a lady called. She was in her 60s, and he was in his 70s at that time. She says, you're talking about all this positive stuff, and I've had nothing but a negative life, and everything is bad. It's going to heck in a handbag. She started crying on the phone, and I was in the studio. And Mr. Ziegler said, how old did you say you were? He said, 63. 63? You're just a spring chicken. Does your mama know where you are? And suddenly she chuckled, and that gave her real hope. See, hope is the foundational quality of all change, said Alfred Adler, the great psychologist. John Maxwell said, if there's hope in the future, there's power in the present. So when you look at the planning, the preparation, the expectation, the mark you leave, and the impression you make, it has to be with this communication arsenal. It has to be with the desire of doing something that is unique and positive. In 1996, I heard Mr. Ziegler speak at a big event at the Georgia Dome. There were 82,000 people there. And I remember walking up to him and saying, Mr. Z, thank you for your influence in my life. Can I ever do something like this? He said, what are you talking about, son? I said, you just spoke to 82,000 people. Can I do that? He said, of course. My immediate response was, I said, sir, I can't imagine doing that. He said, son, if you can't, you won't. If you can't, you won't. He says, don't expect the end of the process while still in the middle of the process. He says, you go as far as you can see. When you get there, you can see further. And I started to take that to heart. This picture is of me speaking to about 24,000 people in Memphis. I remember asking him after one of these events, thanking him. I said, thank you for taking a chance on me. I love his answer. All I did was open one door. All I did was open one door. But I taught you too well for you to be content. There is a false narrative brewing in the society we live in today. And as we start bringing it home, I've got a few stories that will probably lighten the load. But there's a false narrative out there. And that false narrative is somehow having things is bad. Having structure is wrong. Because 50% of this world is operating in a chaotic way. So those of you who have figured out that there are certain steps to take, there's certain actions that everything has an outcome, suddenly you're considered, hey, you know what? I don't quite like how you're doing it. When I started being a positive force for this American dream, I took a lot of flack. People said you're just trying to impress people. I was recently in a prison as a volunteer. Don't look at me strange. Women's prison. 800 women incarcerated at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas. Now, I first started doing prison work in the early 90s. When I walked in front of these women, they looked at me strange. Are you doing this to impress us? I said, no. I'm also not doing it because I'm an expert, because I'm not an expert on being a woman. I said, but I've been a son, I've been a husband, I've been a brother. I've earned the right to talk about a few things. I did about an hour and a half talk, made them laugh, made them cry. In the end, one lady stood up and she says, thank you. I said, well, you're welcome. She says, no, you're the first person that didn't tell me I was a criminal. That's not my job. My job is to inject into humanity the slice of positivity that exists in the here and now. Negativity is so apparent everywhere. Coming down the freeway today, driving down from Los Angeles, same thing. I saw one guy just constantly honking. And I looked at him and I thought to myself, I said, I don't know where you are in a hurry to get to, at least I'm thinking. But wherever you're in a hurry to get to, people are hoping you're delayed. And I don't know why it is, but we have now crossed that chasm. It is easier to be negative. It is easier to be that victimization. And fortunately, the reason I'm grateful for being here today in talking up to the days leading to this day's event is that I'm finally speaking to a group of people who are happy with what they have accomplished, were able to understand that they made a mark, they left an impression, understood the difference between an inheritance and a legacy, enjoyed the building of that legacy, took some action along the way that continued to allow that plan to fulfill. In a broader nature, America is like a sporting event, and this is what's bothering me. You know, every sporting event you go to has 75,000 people desperately in need of exercise. Constantly yelling at 22 people desperately in need of rest. And that seems to have become the great cry of the last 10 years. The last 10 years has suddenly made this model one that doesn't work. And folks, I was just in Zimbabwe about a couple of months ago, where, quote unquote, a dictator won the election again. They don't have a currency. The central bank is non-existent. They use the US dollar as the default currency. And when I was going there, someone said, make sure you take small bills with you because their currency is dirty. And I thought, you know, laundered money or whatever. No, it's physically dirty because they don't have a bank. These guys actually wash it with soap and dry it up to get the dirt off the currency. And I'm looking at that country. Independence since 1980, one person, totalitarian rule. You hear the stories of the hearts of Rwanda and the genocide there, and we begin to realize how blessed we are with this experiment with all of its faults. And that's why like I said, I don't do what I do for a popularity contest, but one of the things that still fascinates me is the privileges we have to do this, to leave a mark. That is one of my greatest regrets, that in the 28 years I've lived here, I took more from this country than I was ever able to give it back. And whatever I'm seeing in front of me as a debacle that is happening on a larger scale happened on my watch. It did. It happened on our watch. When you hear the stories of how different things happen, let me tell you a few, and then we'll begin to wrap up. Years ago in Boston, in one of the hospitals, was a young girl. She was kind of an angry girl. She had lost one of her family members, was a product of the system. And the doctor said she has no hope. Back then they called developmentally disabled people, they were called by different nomenclatures, so they labeled her and put her away in the catacombs of that hospital. And she grew increasingly violent. Along came an elderly nurse, left milk and cookies, and started loving on her. When that girl turned 12, she had a miraculous healing, they said. No longer was she a threat or a menace to society. She could actually be released to be a fully functional member. But the girl of 12 who had been a product of the system did not know anywhere to go. She says, "Where will I go? Let me hang around the hospital and help out." And somehow they took care of her. She ended up having a couple of surgeries on her eye because of some vision problems, went to a school by the name of Perkins, and graduated from there as a valedictorian. You know how the rest of the story unfolds, as Paul Harvey would say, because her life was chronicled into the movie, The Miracle Worker. The little girl, little Annie, became the great Anne Sullivan when the call came from Birmingham, Alabama, into a family of modest means where a young girl of 3 was both blind and deaf and needed help. They sent for Anne Sullivan, who at Perkins had mastered the ability of sign language. But how do you sign to someone who can't hear or see? Annie learned how to sign in the palms of Helen Keller. When Helen Keller was given England's highest honor and was asked, "How did you do so much with a life with debilitating illnesses by the time you were 3?" She said, "If it wasn't for little Annie, the great Anne Sullivan, the world today would not have known Helen Keller." Helen Keller herself was asked, "What is worse than having no sight?" She said, "Having sight and no vision." Turn of the century, Emanuel Ninger was a European migrant, an artist of great talent. But even though he had a great and unusual ability to paint masterpieces, he decided to use his craft the wrong way. He decided to use his craft to counterfeit $20 bills. And his entire apparatus was an easel and an artist's paintbrush and some paint. One day when he went to buy some greens in the local grocer's shop, the water from the greens began to run after the clerk had handled them onto the dollar bill he had just given her, the $20 bill. She alerted the authorities. The authorities came and took Emanuel Ninger to jail. When they raided his attic, they found 3 paintings which in auction in the 20s sold for $16,000. When they asked Emanuel Ninger, "Who did you steal from the most?" he said, "Me." There is so much that I think the world still needs to learn. But I think we need to, rather than look outward, I just wish it'll look back inward. Generations are coming and generations are going. For the first time, we are turning that corner where America is no longer the most desired destination in the world. And that's almost a travesty, because there's no other place where hopes and dreams come alive like they do here. I remember when I wrote The American Dream from an Indian heart. I opened the book by saying, one man looked at a peanut and found many ways to change the world. George Washington Carver found 100 uses for the peanut, 50 uses for the potato, changed the entire way Southern farmers farmed their crops. In another part of the world, someone looks at a peanut and eats it because they're hungry. When I wrote that book, I thought it was sheer brilliance. I sent it off to the publisher. And the publisher sent me back a note saying, dear sir, not only do we want you to stop reading, not only do we want you to stop writing, we want you to stop reading as well. We have never seen such drivel in our lives. Publisher number 2 was a little less hostile. 7 rejections later, I thought I was done. This is no longer a dream, it's a nightmare. Out of the woodwork comes an editor saying, honey, nobody ever taught you about criticism? I said, what are you talking about? She says, give me your book. Let me look at it. I gave her the book, 400 pages. She returned 160. She says, the rest of it is not a book. See, the American Indians have a saying. When they start to build a canoe, how do you build a canoe? You start with a tree and remove all parts that's not a canoe. It's not complicated. Those 162 pages were sent off. That book is in its 5th edition now. It's been on the bestseller list in India for 5 years. In India, not because it's something about the American dream. In India, I think people think it's a book on how to get to America. But I'll never trade all those rejections for the expression on my daddy's face when that man who studied under that streetlight, who was wed to that child bride, walks through the bookstore in rural India and says, that's my boy. Legacies, the things we do as we come to a close. There are only 2 things we can say in this world: I wish I had, or I'm glad I did. That's it. That's the sum total of every journey. I added that this morning. A generational influence is one without regret and full of evidence. Many years ago, in one of the cathedrals in Europe flowed some of the most beautiful music, but today was a sad day. The old man who had played the organ was going to have to retire and walk away into the sunset of his life. As he gently locked that organ, big tears started streaming down his cheeks because this is all he had ever done. How can you take away that which I know more than anything else? But he dutifully locked the organ and started to walk through the apse out into the cobblestone courtyard. In the recess was a youngster, spry and energetic. He sprang forward, ran to the front and said, Master, the key. Reluctantly, the old man gave him the key. The youngster took the key, ran to the front, opened the organ and proceeded to play. The old man was now outside. His tears of anguish dried up. New ones of joy were flowing down his cheeks as music more beautiful than he had ever heard was coming out of that cathedral. And he thought to himself, what if I had denied the real master the key? See, but before we celebrate the old man's wisdom, let's look at the youngster. See, had that youngster stood here and said, I don't want to try it, I'll just be compared to the old man. Or had he stood here and said, I don't want to do this here, I'll find my own arena. Or had he stood at the 3rd spot and said, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, but I just don't feel like. The world today would not have known the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. And much of the way music has been written since. The great Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, the greatest tragedy of all is not the loss of natural resources, though that is a great tragedy. The greatest tragedy of all is the loss of human resources. Because most people will leave with their finest wisdom still within them. So if nobody has ever celebrated you before, let this young immigrant celebrate you for the lives you've led, the legacies you'll leave, the opportunities you created so someone like me in a distant shore could dream of a place like this. I don't know how much time it'll take, but the gratitude still needs to exist, because in some far-off country, there is still someone saying, you know what? I wonder if that place still has possibility. But with all seriousness, let me end on a funny note, because that's what we came here to have fun. All this said and done, I'm really glad I live here, and I'm really glad I have a thick hide. Nothing bothers me anymore. I was standing in West Palm Beach, Florida, outside an airport hotel, waiting for the shuttle to take me to the airport and eventually to my bride. I'd just done a seminar for a Fortune 30 company. I was flying higher than a kite. But when you look like me, you're wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and you're standing outside an airport hotel, the odds are a lot of people are not going to mistake me for being Zig Ziglar's international cultural ambassador. A couple of people mistook me for being an educated baggage handler, and here's how the story goes. I'm standing there minding my own business, living the dream, when I notice the shuttle driver running late. So I pick up my bags and put them in the van. See, my papa taught me, be it a job, big or small, do it well or not at all. Your word is your bond. If your word's no good, you're no good. So I put my bags in the van. That way, when the shuttle driver came, I didn't need to blame him for anything. We could just get up and leave. The lady standing next to me looked like she'd fallen asleep in a salad bar. She had the hat with the whole fruit number working. She used her nose, which doubled as a pointer, and asked me to put her bags in the van. Baggage handling is easy, you just lift. The dude standing next to her now wants to get involved in this little immigrant episode. He grunts for me to put his bags in the van, which I did. Folks, I just spent an hour and a half bragging on this country. I called it the last bastion of freedom and opportunity, the only Eden this side of heaven. Most of you know what I did next. I went for the tip. I put my hand out in front of the gal. She gave me a buck and change. I put my hand out in front of the guy. He gave me a buck and change. They were ignorant. I made $3. What a country. When I got in the van, I flipped my luggage tag over, Intergalactic Yoda for Motivational Mecca or whatever it said. The man didn't recognize me, but he recognized my boss. He said, "Oh my God, I made a horrible mistake." I said, "You're not getting your money back." At which point he said the words that make the story tellable. He said, "I wish all my employees had your disposition." Folks, ultimately, that's what I think the American dream is. The American dream is not about stuff. It's not about opportunity. It's not about possibility. The American dream is all of those things will come if you have the right disposition. If you plan, you prepare, you legitimately can expect. One time I'm standing in Dallas outside a hotel where I had just done a speech. And this is my final story. I was wearing a tuxedo. When guys dress up, we look like waiters. When women dress up, you look amazing. So we walked out like penguins from that dinner, and I had just spoken at that dinner. And I'm waiting in front of this luxury hotel. And a guy walks up to me, he says, "I want a cab." I don't know what you know about good hotels, but they sit right there. If you raise your hand, one will come. So I raised my hand, one came. He put a buck in my pocket and put it in my pocket. I'd just spoken for this group. Soon there was a line behind me. Another guy said, "I'll take one." Sure. Here comes my bride in her sequin gown. "What are you doing?" I said, "If you're quiet, I think I can pay for dinner." Hopefully we were able to laugh a little, cry a little, reminisce a little, reflect a little. But the way I want to say thank you to you is simply this. Folks, I've literally traveled the world and the 7 seas. I've been on my highs, and many a night I wept on my knees. But of all the groups I've spoken to, the most humbled I've felt is my time with you. I'm Manila's husband and Nick's dad saying thank you for what you represent, and God bless each and every one of you.
Thank you so much. We have a small gift for you, nowhere near as valuable as what you just gave us. I need to share with you. Wasn't he wonderful? Man. I need to share with you a little bit here. This book has just come out. This is hot off the press. It was written by Krish, and it's called Hard-Headed and Soft-Hearted. Is that a classic title? Hard-Headed and Soft-Hearted. It just barely came out. And I was perusing it at dinner tonight. A lot of fun stuff, which doesn't surprise you. Does it surprise you that he would write a fun book? Really interesting. So again, Krish, we thank you for coming. We appreciate the presentation and the gifts that you have given us. And thank you for all of you for coming. Drive home carefully. Good night.